respects to the Tupinamba and Pagajas communities. Today's session brings together four exceptional leaders who are right at the heart of the intersection of trade, climate ambition, industrial decarbonization, and just transition. They don't, I assume, need an introduction, but I'll do it anyways. First, I'd like to welcome Sharon Barrow AC, who has been a lifelong advocate for social justice in energy transitions. Sharon serves as the first female General Secretary of International Trade Union Confederation, where she played a crucial role in ensuring the idea of just transition was woven into the Paris Agreement. She continues to shape global thinking of people-centered climate action through her roles in European Climate Foundation, the IEA Commission on People-Centered Transitions, and Climate Works Center recently, among many others. Next, I'd like to introduce Pak Paul Butar, the head of Secretariat of Indonesia's Just Energy Transition Partnership, JSPs, one of the world's most high-profile transition finance programs. Paul brings over 3 decades of experience in climate and energy policy, working across ministries, multilateral development banks, and with the industry to design blended finance mechanisms and low-carbon investment frameworks. Joining us from the finance and governance side is Nicole Yazbek-Martin, the Executive Manager for Sustainability Standards and Practice at the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute, ASFI. Nicole has spent her career driving systems change toward a more sustainable and inclusive economy, from her time in DQ, the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water, to her work shaping Australia's sustainable finance architecture. At ASFI, she's helping to ensure that our financial system is resilient and aligned with long-term sustainability goals. And last but not the least, we'll hear from Joanna Kay, the Program Director for International Strategy at the Superpower Institute. Joanna brings deep expertise at the nexus of technology, trade and diplomacy, connecting Australia's clean energy strengths with regional opportunities. She's been instrumental in shaping Australia's national hydrogen strategy, has advised the International Solar Alliance, and continues to champion Australia's emerging role as the superpower partner to the Southeast Asia's energy transition. And a quick intro of myself, the moderator. My name is Ceren. I work as the acting Southeast Asia lead at Climate Works Center, which is an independent not-for-profit organization within Monash University with the mission to accelerate ambitious evidence-based climate action in Australia and Southeast Asia. Together, our speakers will help us unpack how Australia and Southeast Asia can collaborate to advance clean manufacturing, strengthen green trade, and ensure that industrial decarbonization is competitive and inclusive. Let's dive in with you, Sharon. You've been a global voice in social justice in energy transition, helping embed the concept of just transition into the Paris Agreement to shaping people-centered climate strategies around the world. And an important aspect of green trade is to create green jobs and transform labor markets, which I love your framing as the development story. So how can governments and industries ensure that industrial decarbonization and relatedly green trade results in decent work, fair wages, and social protection mechanisms, especially in emerging economies such as in Southeast Asia?
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. There is no doubt that this transition is a development story. It's not just a development story in the traditional sense of the word about emerging economies. It's a development story for developing economies, emerging economies, and the nations who are once seen as the prosperous nations who are very much at risk, if they don't transition, of being left behind. So everybody can win from this transition. It must be just, but it is also an opportunity for a world that's very different. And I would make 3 points. You will not achieve the transition or the justice in the transition if you don't put people at the heart of the co-design of our future. If we're not prepared to co-create a future, to bring people into the mix from the very beginning, then we risk opposition, the continuing lack of trust, and we know that when you look at any example around the world, agency builds trust. Because if people have a say in their own future, they have a sense that they've got not just a stake in it, Not just a benefit, but a responsibility. The second point I would make is that for Australia, living in the region we do, the narrative is very different to that of the, kind of chest beating and wailing about the US, because if you look through Asia, then the transition is moving apace. And Australia has all of the natural resources, the sun, the wind, but it also has the minerals, the capacity, and I know others will do this more justice, but to embed the carbon solutions in clean exports. And if we're not serious about clean exports, then you can't map backwards for Australia and think about what the jobs are. And indeed, it's a future we all want to embrace. The third thing is something I heard last night, actually, and it's a way of describing the issues for trade that I've been saying, but not in as eloquent a manner. So I'm going to steal this notion. But when multilateralism breaks down, there's no doubt we need it and we have to fight to rebuild it. But when multilateralism breaks down, what's the answer? It's minilateralism. It's actually reaching out and building the partnerships, whether they're community partnerships, whether they're industrial partnerships, whether they're pure trade partnerships, but treating people as equals across that relationship. So you get the joint ventures, you get the offtake agreements, you get the investment, and from my perspective, you get the jobs and the justice. And I want to say one more thing. This is also an opportunity to realign our economic systems a little, but we can grow it. Because when I'm looking at my First Nation sister here, Anne, I know that in a country like Australia, if you don't understand that the rights holders, they don't just have equity, they have ownership. And if they aren't indeed equal partners, their own entrepreneurs, if we aren't looking at the mechanisms, then we're not talking about justice. But equally, we know that if you move beyond the Indigenous ownership and involvement, we can create community benefit sharing from these new industries that mean that there's a return, not on a transactional social licence basis, that's important but not enough, but on a return to community about sharing the equity of new renewables-based clean tech futures. So this is about everything. Trade's at the heart of it, but it's got to be based on equal and trusting relationships with people from all the nations involved, all the communities right up front, co-creating a future.
Thank you very much for setting the scene for us, Sharon. I'll turn to you, Pakpol, to discuss a bit on how one of the Southeast Asia's leading examples, Indonesia's JETP, is putting these ideas into practice. You're heading one of the world's most closely watched transition programs. The JETP in Indonesia is one of the most high-profile energy transition finance packages and a global reference for many people on blended finance. So I'm wondering if you can share a bit on the lessons that can be drawn from this experience to mobilize private capital for industrial decarbonisation, and how can regional trade and industrial strategies support these outcomes? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, sir, and thank you for inviting me here. And thank you for being in the panel where I'm the most handsome person.
I do that in all my panels.
Yeah, thank you. The first for me actually among the women. So good for that. Okay, thank you for the question. For those of you who have not followed that JETP that much, Just Energy Transition Partnership, it was back in 2022 when Indonesia, let's say, agreed with 10 nations and 7 banks to support the energy transition in Indonesia. We initially, let's say, focus on the on-grid project, power sector, and we develop our, let's say, scenario how we can meet the target for limiting the emissions of power sector to 250 million ton by 2030. And we find out that we will need actually until 2030, we will need around 100 billion US dollar just for, let's say, investing in renewable grid expansion, coal phase out, and so on. And then 20, 20 billion initially was pledged by partners, 10 billion from commercial and 10 billion from public. But with the withdrawal of US from all the climate related issues, then we got actually less 2 billion. Although the 2 billion, we still can use it actually, but will not be marked as JETP, but will be as part of the bilateral cooperation. But in addition to that, Japanese actually support us additional for about 1.8 billion to, let's say, provide financing for the extension of the MRT in Jakarta. So now we have around 21.6 billion actually as a pledge, but only about 3 billion that has been approved so far. The third 3 billion, that is 1.8 billion, around 1.8 billion for the transportation, for the electrification of the train. That's will be prepared by Japanese. And then we have already 2 projects approved and start construction. One is for floating, one is for geothermal. And waiting for approval for about 6 billion, and mostly for transmission and also for the renewable. So from what we have seen in the pipeline that we have in the under JETP, the first project that was approved is combination between public, so a kind of blended finance provided by private arms of AFD and the DEG for floating, plus financing from Standard Chartered. So that's a blended. Then the second is from JICA, from Japan for geothermal. They include as well Mizuho and other financial institution for that project. And we expect other project actually on renewable implemented by other subsidiary of PLN, the state-owned company, for floating and others. Also combination between private and public. So what we have seen in the financing of all of these projects, we see actually some, let's say, a good combination, public and private, but there are also, let's say, how do you call it? We see, for example, the private arms of the MDBs. So they call it private arms as well, but it's actually not as let's say, as commercial as the typical commercial banks. They are also trying to, let's say, finance some of the projects. For example, there are 4 projects or 5 projects to be implemented by let's say, one of the subsidiary of the PLN. The private arms of MDB also come in. So crowding out sometimes the private financing. That becomes a kind of, let's say, create a kind of tension. I would say tension between the private and private arms of the MDB, because of course the private arms of the MDB actually could provide slightly better terms than those of the commercial financing. And that's sometimes actually, to my understanding, is actually not so, how should I say that? We should avoid something like that. So in our conversation in Indonesia, we always, especially when it's related to JETP, we always say, whatever that could be financed by privates, then let's the private finance it. So let's save the public funding for those projects that actually, let's say, provide less return. So in our conversation, because around 10 billion is, let's say, public money that part of the JETP, we discussed with government that this 10 billion should be used to finance transmissions. So because transmission is typically, let's say, activities that is not necessarily provide good return. So return of 3-4%, internal calculation by state utility company, or sometimes it's only 2%. If you really want to connect to remote area, then sometimes it's just, let's say, obligation without return. So we told government that we should focus the public money for area where the return is not actually expected. While let's say, if possible, all project that should be financed, that could be financed by private, let private do that. So we have seen, for example, some projects in Indonesia that where the MDBs try to finance to get their hand into that kind of project, including actually climate finance. We had a kind of, let's say, I would not say heat debate with one of the member of the IPG, because they're trying to finance floating solar with their climate finance. We tell them, no. Please, if you really want to finance with the climate, so buying, for example, ITMO from Indonesia, you should buy that from projects that need high capital, for example, geothermal, not from floating. Floating can be financed by everyone. So geothermal, on the other hand, so the development cost or the total cost per megawatt of geothermal will reach up to 5 million, and the return is normally very low. So maybe for international 8%, 6%, that should be enough. But for the, let's say, local developers, 8%, especially because the tariff is in rupiah, then it will be a very, very thin margin that they could get from geothermal. That's why we have not seen so much, let's say, development in geothermal in Indonesia, because it's so expensive. While for the floating, so let's private do that. So the division between public and private financing should be clearly made, so that focusing on commercial financing for projects that provide good return. But on the other hand, use the public money for let's say, less return. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Paul. Let me turn on to the finance and regulatory standards, to you, Nicole. You've been shaping frameworks that make capital flow more sustainable and inclusive initiatives. So if you can share your insights on how Australia's leadership in the finance frameworks, taxonomies, regulatory standards be leveraged to support the development of low-carbon manufacturing ecosystems across the region.
Thank you very much. And I actually, after listening to Sharon speak, I thought, I don't know if I can do any better than that. But I think maybe just to take a second to explain our fundamental approach that we took to the development of the Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. For us, what was really, really clear is we needed to have the destination in mind at the beginning of the process. And that destination is Paris, the achievement of the Paris Agreement objectives. And I think that's really important, because that gives you the end point. If you think about the transformation of our economy as a GPS map, and we need to find out where we're going so we can tell the Uber driver that's how we're going to get there. We are actually all going to be coming from our own homes, and if you think about Southeast Asia is a region with all our own homes, the pathway to get there might be longer or shorter, but we all need to reach that destination point, and it's really, really important. And what that enabled us to do is then, okay, this is the top down, that's where we need to get to. And if we're operating in that world, this is what the performance of particularly new assets needs to look like. And that's where you get things like thresholds and performance. But our economy doesn't look like that today. So for new assets, of course, we can say this is the end point, and this is what the performance needs to look like. But how do we transform all of our existing assets? And if we take that with relevance to Indonesia and Southeast Asia, the manufacturing powerhouses of the world, they make the things that all of us want and do. How do we take those existing businesses that are going to need to transform from within, so decarbonize through capital investments in their processes, in their energy sources, and decarbonize that? We're not going to be changing those industries. And so we need to think about, when we think about transition, are we still talking thresholds? Are we actually thinking about what does that suite of capital investment look like? And so that was a very, it sounds pretty simple when you say it, but it took a lot of time to get to when we were talking about transition, what we actually mean. Because people really get themselves twisted in a knot about, well, if green means performing at X threshold, then transition means potentially performing at slightly worse. But that tells you nothing about what you need to do to get from here to there. And so really our approach in the Australian taxonomy was think about all the, I know you guys have probably heard Sean Kidney from CBI talk about it, that shopping list of things that could help transform existing manufacturing, existing economic processes, and let's make sure that we can provide that clarity to private capital to say that is where you need to be supporting your customers and your clients to actually decarbonize. And I think that that's the relevance between what we can learn, what we've learned in Australia, that we can engage with our friends and colleagues and family in the region, is that that shopping list might look a little bit more, there might be a few less things on that list in the manufacturing, but either way, we can actually all support each other, start talking the same language in an inclusive way, and make sure that capital that goes to a manufacturing plant in Australia, capital that goes to a manufacturing plant in Indonesia, understand we know what we need to be investing in. And it's actually been a privilege. My team, much smarter than me, the detailed people in Indonesia last week, engaging with your colleagues in terms of thinking about that shopping list in the manufacturing criteria of the update to the OJK taxonomy, to really be starting to talk that common language. And I think that hope is that once we understand what that transformation of manufacturing looks like, regardless of what your starting point looks like in Southeast Asia, in Japan, in Australia, then investors can really get behind that and know where they need to be deploying capital.
Amazing, thank you so much. I'll turn to you now, Joanna. From your work at the Superpower Institute, you're right at the intersection of innovation, trade policy, and clean energy diplomacy. So I would like you to unpack a bit on the most strategic ways that Australia can act as a catalyst through finance, technology transfer, and trade frameworks to accelerate green manufacturing across the region. Where do you see the biggest opportunities for Australia to act as a superpower partner in supporting the net zero aligned innovation ecosystems in the region?
Fantastic, thank you. And let me just start also by acknowledging particularly First Nation women. I always do that. They are the original storytellers and heartbeat of community. So very happy to have First Nation women here today. Thank you. I think it is very difficult. Sharon, we should get you a job at the Superpower Institute. I think Ross Garner would be very, very happy with the narrative that you spoke about, although you didn't mention a carbon price. So we'll work on that. Just to give you some context, the Superpower Institute, or TSI, is really about how do we prepare our economy for the future in a post-carbon world. We know that the world is going to decarbonise. We know that economies are going to shift, and how do we position Australia to be able to make the best of that? And that's not just about us. That's also about our trading partners and our region. And we had a Future Made in Australia legislation come out last year, and that's certainly about a future made with our partners across the region as well, and that certainly includes Southeast Asia. I think the comment about multilateralism and the shift in trade order is a really important one to kind of talk about initially. You know, in March, I think it was, the Liberty Day tariffs that the United States released kind of put a bit of a jolt into what we consider to be a trade system that has functioned and worked for many years. Australia and other middle powers like Indonesia and others across Southeast Asia really work well when those trade systems stick by the rules. So we do hope that we can share and push and advocate for those trade systems to be in place. But as Sharon so rightly mentioned, if that's not the case, then there are opportunities to do it directly with our partners, and that's through just transition, that's through industry, that's through collaboration, but it's also very much through innovation and technology exchange as well. One thing I think Australia does incredibly well is that we have a lot of up-and-coming technology. We are able to share it across the region. We have, a few examples. We have Energy Exemplar, who are doing a lot of data analysis on what can happen with our gas and trade, and it is very much a success in Indonesia, and we can certainly lean on our personal capital and our talent to help others decarbonise. The other one, which I think is a really important, is another one based in South Australia called H2H, which is producing zero carbon seaweed to feed to livestock, which then therefore makes the carbon in agriculture a little less. It's probably not the technical way that they would describe it, but our kind of exports of that, and that is something that certainly we could share with Southeast Asia to help both of us decarbonise. But really, we see at TSI the opportunities, these big superpower industries. So we see critical and strategic minerals. We have a lot of copper in Australia, some of the world's largest resources of copper. The world needs copper to decarbonise. We need copper to increase transmission lines. You can't have a transition without transmission, and that's certainly something that we should and be keeping in our minds at the forefront when we're talking about trade and opportunity there as well. We also see an opportunity with green iron. So one of our key pieces that we've done at TSI is release a green iron report. We did some economic modelling around where are the best places in Australia that we could actually achieve this. But what does it mean for the world? And actually, if we're able to decarbonise our green iron, our iron ore exports and make them green iron, we've already cut out at least 4% of emissions globally as well. And given that Australia is responsible for about 1.4% of global emissions, that's definitely batting above our pay grade, which is absolutely extraordinary. You add green fuels to that, that's another 4 or 5%. And then other commodities like the copper, polysilicon, and you're close to 10% of global emissions that we can actually use. So that is incredibly important. And I think the other thing with that is, to Sharon's point, now that she works for us as well, is that it's about the supply chain, right? So it's about making sure that we are offering each other mutually beneficial things so that all of our economies can grow. And that's the thing that this region will do really, really well, right? We can grow through the taxonomy work, which is incredibly impressive. COP provides us that platform to do that. It's an opportunity to meet with NGOs, trade organisations, departments of state, and actually create an architecture to do that. Trade diplomacy, climate diplomacy is a really key part of that, leaning on our colleagues at DFAT and DQ, Department of Foreign Affairs, and our climate change departments, as well as Austrade, to really make sure that we're extending what Australia is doing and talking about and leveraging those kind of bilateral relationships as well.
Amazing. Thanks, Joanna. I'll move forward with the second round of questions, but feel free to jump in if you have any burning questions, and please feel free to tag along and intervene to make it more interactive as well. I'll turn to you again, Sharon, and given your global experience in labor and just transition dialogues, can you tell us a bit about the policy levers? What are the policy levers that are most effective in embedding social dialogue and worker participation in the nexus of trade, green to commodities, and climate action?
Thank you. Well, I actually think that the first policy lever is to stop thinking in silos. If you actually think about what it takes to create the transition, then of course it is an industrial narrative, and the development issues in terms of clean products and trade that we can actually enable. But you can no longer think of mining, agriculture, energy, infrastructure as being somehow separate, because they're not. You've heard it here. It is actually about, who funds our infrastructure. Because in the end, if we're serious, energy is going to be virtually free. It's what is the cost of the infrastructure to deliver it, and who benefits from, indeed, the production of energy in terms of electrification, number one challenge, you know, and of course the affordability of that. But if we stop thinking in silos, then you start thinking about co-use. You start thinking about those relationships that say it's no longer about an extractive trade methodology. It's about a joint venture that allows us to actually share cooperative benefits. And of course, with people being at the heart of that in terms of prosperity. But it's also about finance. And I'm really grateful to Nicole and her team and all the others working on finance, because I can tell you, as a much younger woman who helped build those superannuation funds in Australia, and let me tell you, we took a lot of cuts on our backs for suggesting that workers could build capital, that we'd be prepared to give up deferred wages to invest in not just dignified retirement incomes, but in investment in Australia. But of course, we'd learned some of this from our international brothers and sisters too. And I can tell you that as a global leader, and I'll give you one example of this, when you couldn't get, in the first Trump administration, the capital or the developers for offshore wind off the coast of New York, despite the alignment of the mayor, the governor, the unions, the universities, in terms of the Good Jobs Council, etc., then Clean Jobs Council, I should say, then we actually went to another country and we said to the pension funds in Denmark and to Ørsted, would you be interested in developing offshore wind off New York and down the coast ultimately to Virginia? They said yes. So the relationships you built was a mini nationalism approach. So you just find the ways to go round it. But one of the things that is worrying me most in Australia at the moment is that we have lost an appetite. We used to call it venture capital. That just sounds like it's, you know, it's important, but it's out there. I call it patient capital. You will never invest in development in the big clean energy transitions we need if you're not prepared to invest in our startups. And by that, I mean everything from our community energy co-ops through to our clean iron and steel startups who don't require a lot of capital. Most of our super funds wouldn't get out of bed for the kind of capital they need. And in fact, I'm seeing Marcus from MCI Carbon here, and that's a story in itself. The green iron story, the green steel story out of Collie is another one. You know, unable to get capital in Australia because we're not prepared, with all the due diligence of contractual relations, to actually wait 5, 7, 10 years for those industries to scale up. You'll get your money back, and pension funds by themselves are able to look over a lifetime. So I know ClimateWorks is absolutely in the centre, and a lot of other people about tweaking this, but we have $4 trillion of workers' capital. It's owned by workers in Australia. If we had 1 or 2% of that to fund these startups on a patient capital basis, what are we doing? Like, what are we doing? So end the siloism, co-use, co-development, finance, people, put them all in a mix and get the integrated economic plan for all our regions and industries in Australia.
Very well said, Sharon. I also just want to add that if Australia wants to actually achieve its national determined contribution, we actually do need to change policy. The existing policy will not help us get there. So that's a really important piece. One of the things that we've been looking at the Superpower Institute is, you know, a price on carbon, and recognising that perhaps there's not a political will for that at the moment. But how do you actually fix those market failures that sit in there as well? So we've certainly put forward recommendations on production tax credits to offset that kind of price or that green premium, thinking about capex funding for these big projects, so we can actually get these first movers happening and we can accelerate those learnings as well. Your point about infrastructure is really important because it needs to be shared infrastructure, but who actually pays for that? And that's a really, you know, a fundamental question. State government, federal government, is it the projects, is it the community? What does that look like? And how do we accelerate the actual build out of those things as well? The other thing I want to mention is the diesel tax fuel rebate. If we can roll that back a little bit, we might actually be able to fund some of these things as well. So if we stop actually funding the fossil fuel industry and actually put that money back into the green industry and the opportunity that we have, we know it's going to be huge dividends for us, particularly economically. Part of our modelling has suggested it's about a $400 billion opportunity by 2050, which is about 4 times the existing opportunity that we have. So the money is there, well spent, and it will come back to us in tenfold.
Amazing. I'm a bit cautious of time. We have 8 minutes until the hard deadline. So I'll turn back to you, Paul, about your early points about the public and private finance differentiation. And if you can unpack how these can work hand in hand to deliver emission reduction, industrial competitiveness, and socioeconomic benefits.
Thank you.
And
Thank
then
you.
I'll come to you, Nicole.
Thank you. Can we get the 2% for Indonesian decarbonisation from what you just said? Would be very helpful for us because.
I could add another percent for you.
Okay. Yeah, because that's actually what missing. So the let's say especially for let's say building infrastructure as Joanna mentioned, building infrastructure, building also supporting the decarbonization, especially for the small scale industries. That this funding is actually missing. Even as part of the JETP, for example, when we talk with financiers, and they said, okay, my ticket size is 25 million up. So while industrial carbonization sometimes only need 1 million, sometimes less or less than their ticket size, and that becomes a problem actually for us in our JETP. We have, let's say, a kind of energy efficiency project that come to us. They only need around 9 million and so for hospital decarbonization. So energy efficiency and electrification in the hospital. No one would be willing to finance. That's why the 2% will be very important for us. So that's actually the problem with when it comes to energy efficiency, the ticket size will be the problem. And in this case, if we could, for example, develop a kind of pool of fund that could finance this kind of small size industrial decarbonization project, it will help a lot in the let's say meeting all of this industrial decarbonization effort. That's what missing. But to your point, Sharon, as part of our JETP, let's say in Indonesia, we actually developed so-called Just Transition Framework. What we have put there is actually that for every project that will be labeled as JETP, they should implement the so-called Just Transition Framework that include, for example, all of this related to displacement, work, let's say, related to jobs and so on, including sustainability and the economic diversification. So we think, for example, about one renewable energy project, hydro, for example. If you build large-scale hydro project, and most probably that you will have to, let's say, move people around out of the project site. And how can you help them to guarantee that after the project, after the payment of the, let's say, of the land, that they still be able to, let's say, get their money, livelihood over the years after the project is operating. That's one of the concerns that we have. We put it in our Just Transition Framework, and that we recommended them to really implement that as a basic condition for labeling it as a JETP and receiving a kind of let's say blended finance, lower interest rate financing. But the sometimes is actually that, for example, thinking about Chinese companies that invest in Indonesia, in China, they have to meet a very stringent environmental conditions. But when it comes to, let's say, investing in Indonesia, sometimes actually they don't really follow that, what they have done, what they have to let's say, to meet in their home country. The same thing like Australian companies or any companies that operating in Indonesia, sometimes actually not following what they should do in their home country. And this is something that we really need to look at, especially when it comes to the decarbonization. There are, for example, Australian companies that operate in Indonesia, but they don't follow the Australian conditions. And this is something that really need to look at, especially when we discussed last time with one of the professor from Australia, trying to look at how CBAM could work for Australia, then you should actually think about how it could, let's say, put the same conditions wherever you invest in, and whatever finance that you could get in to invest in that country. Thank you.
I just wanted to pick up on Joanna's point, actually, and then I'll, 1 second, and I'll hand to Nicole to finish. But, you know, it is about a price on carbon. But there's a way of looking at this that is, if you repurpose those fossil fuel subsidies, if you said to companies, you can keep them but use them or lose them in terms of clean tech transition, we would change the world. And so, because they're not going to lose them, and, well, not willingly. And then we get to reinvest them. But the other thing about a price on carbon is everyone talks about the green premium. It annoys me to tears because it's actually the fossil fuel discounts. And when we get a level playing field, Joanna, then we'll have made the day.
Nicole, I'll hand it over to you to wrap up, and
Yeah.
we'll turn to the panel.
All right, so I'm going to, I think, talk about how all of this, I'm going to try and pull this all together because I think each one of the panelists have made some really excellent points. I'll start with you because I think the point that you made about that level playing field and the common frameworks is extremely important. If we are going to move towards that win-win global decarbonisation, that common language and the common set of rules is so important. Now, I'm a rules gal. I work in standards and governance. I mean, very exciting. And it does excite me because it enables all of us to be on the same page and get things done. So that is a necessary precondition. I think the second point that has been, I think, so well made by you, Sharon, is that we cannot do this alone, right? We need each other more than we ever have. And as the world retreats into isolationism, I'm saying let's buck the trend and go the other way. Australia has got something to offer. Our neighbours have got something to offer. We both have a comparative advantage. There is a win-win situation for Australia to go a little bit downstream, to use our exceptional clean energy resource, which is in abundance, to decarbonise those heavy pieces, to ensure that we have good jobs and we have a shared equitable economy in our own country, and we can look to our neighbours to say, you take over advanced manufacturing in our green industries, and we can look to the north and say, buy our great green stuff together, right? So we need to be looking at those trade relationships. We need to be saying, what can Australia do to shore up the supply? That's our part of the job. What can we work together with private capital to help decarbonise and support industry in Southeast Asia to become that green power manufacturing? And then, hey guys, on the other side, come buy our green stuff and put those frameworks in place that enable those advanced market commitments, put your money where your mouth is, and that creates the pricing system which pulls it all through. And then just one last thing on the diesel rebate, and I absolutely love, Sharon told me her idea the other day for the first time. I said, that's genius. But I think just the flip is not just the cost of paying people for using diesel. It's the disincentive that creates to decarbonize their existing industry. Because if you electrify your truck, you don't get your diesel rebate. So, I mean, I would say that the cost whammy of that policy alone is just abhorrent. So, all in all, it's been a fantastic panel for everyone. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I won't attempt to wrap up after those remarks. Brilliant. And I'm getting warnings that our time is up for the next session. So please join me in thanking our panelists, Sharon, Paul, Nicole, and John, for sharing your insights and experience. Today's conversation highlighted how just transitions, finance innovation, and international cooperation can come together to shape a resilient low-carbon manufacturing future for our region. And thank you very much for insight, for being part of the discussion, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.